thankful to say it's none of the bar organizations that I participate with, but the organizations is a, you know, we need to get another statement, pull up the last one, let's change some names and words a little bit. And it's almost to the point that a lot of the statements that I see out there, I just kind of wonder, okay, they sent out another statement. Why? What's the purpose? And I think you were talking a little bit about the intent aspect, and I'm wondering, you know, to some extent, what's the purpose when some of these organizations are just pulling up the last one, change the name, and throw it out? Can you talk to us about what the organizations should do at that step? Like, what is the way to break out of that mold of just pulling up the previous form and actually taking that next step?
Yeah, I think it's not simple, but the idea is that you already have things in place that are supporting or doing the work of the statements, right, before they even happen. So usually so a lot of times a statement or a pledge is in response to change something, or a, you know, acknowledgement, whatever that is. And so, you know, the goal is that of different organizations, that's a foundational piece to what you're already doing, right? That BIPOC people continuously feel supported. They recognize that there's still work that needs to be done in organizations in terms of policy and education and whatnot. And that's just kind of built in to the space already. And so this is not the case for everyone, but if an organization is consistently and constantly putting out, you know, statements like very, very regularly, that would make me possibly question, you know, what is going on that's needed. Because if, like I said, the ultimate goal is that that's just built in. There's built-in resources, there's built-in space, there's built-in conversations. So, you know, they don't have to individually necessarily maybe respond to every single thing that's going on, and that's more of an internal type of support. And I mean, I'm not an expert on every single, obviously every single institution and every single business. And so I'm sure there's other reasons that other organizations, even other legal organizations, do put statements. And maybe that is coming internally. Maybe that is coming from people of color who want that. You know, I'm not sure. But I think, you know, putting your time and energy into, you know, making what you feel the need to say in statements just a foundation of your practice in your space, if that makes sense.
And I see that Sarah had posted a question here on the Q&A section. Everybody's welcome to throw questions in the chat, and you can switch it to all panelists and attendees if you want to talk there. But to address Sarah's question is wondering how, and she says Mitchell Hamline, but also MSBA, are addressing pushback from students, faculty, or members with the MSBA that aren't as far along in the anti-racist journey. And I'm going to add to that because I've had organizations that are not necessarily not in support of BIPOC issues, but also at the same time saying, yeah, but what about me? Yeah, but what about me? I don't fit in that BIPOC, but I am, you know, a marginalized group. You know, why am I not being addressed as well? So I'll throw that up there to both.
Well, Landon, I appreciate your question, and I just want to acknowledge that all of us have been or had the experience of being other. Like at some point in our lives, someone has said, you don't belong here. And so we know that pain and of that exclusion. We know what it means when someone tells us we don't belong. So I've always found it very effective to have broad-based inclusivity as part of everything we do. So in other words, you can commit to diversity, but the inclusion piece I think is critical because all of us have had that feeling. And so when the conversation seems to focus on just diversity without including everybody, so everyone belongs here, that means I belong as a white woman, and other people who do not necessarily have distinguishing characteristics that might, fit in what we consider diverse categories. How do we bring people who fit in those categories? Don't they belong too? And so when people think in a zero-sum way, like if someone belongs and I don't, that means I don't belong, or someone's special or recognized and I don't belong because I'm not special in that way, there is a dynamic there that tends to undermine work toward diversity and inclusion. And so what I like to do and really think it's critical is recognize the pain that people are really feeling when the conversation seems to exclude them in diversity and inclusion and bring everyone along, which means, again, everyone belongs here. And so as we work to diversify and be more inclusive and to fulfill our goals on these kind of pledges, we have to make sure that everyone still feels that they're valued and part of that conversation, even if they may not agree with everything we say.
Yeah, I just want to be a little bit, follow along with what Robin's saying and just be a little careful too about this, is that I don't want inclusion to mean that everybody's got to feel comfortable about what we're talking about, because these are going to be tough conversations. The reality is that there's been particular groups of individuals who have felt outside all the time. And so when we try to say we want everybody to feel included, that sometimes means exclusion to other groups because it means remaining the status quo. I think it's important to make everybody feel like their voice is heard, that they can talk, and it's a safe environment for that. But I always want to just separate out inclusion from being comfortable. It's because, I've had a lot of, answering the question that was in the Q&A here. I have gotten blowback from some of my statements. I got blowback from the anti-racist statement, but not a lot. I always like to put these things in perspective. The last email the last announcement we did for the Chauvin trial verdict, we sent it out to our alums, and we got maybe 5 or 6 people that wrote things saying that, it's not systemic racism out there in our justice system, blah, 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 a lot of the same stuff that you might hear out there. But then, we have to step back and go, okay, that's 5 people out of 16,000 people that we contacted. Let's also look at the people that believe in this. So we sometimes are too quick to adjust to that negative thing that we hear and not think about how this is empowering for people that have generally never felt empowered before. And to me, that's what's really important. I'm more worried about somebody leaving their job or leaving the school because they were felt excluded because of race or something that's related that they can't control, as opposed to somebody leaving or not feeling included because they've been uncomfortable because we're asking them to confront systemic racism or issues that might make them feel uncomfortable. That's to me what means to be anti-racist. It's not, let's not try not to be racist. Let's actually take steps to be anti-racist. And that's really what this means. And so that's, I agree. I think that we also always have to think broadly, because I think that there's other underrepresented groups out there. I think we sometimes lose sight of disability, inclusion. I think we forget sometimes about inclusion of some different types of political viewpoints. I think that all you want to support that. My answer to that is always open up a dialogue. Yesterday morning, I had a conversation with one of our students who claimed to be conservative, whatever that means in this day and age. But he wanted to say, point out that he doesn't feel included in some of the discussions. And so there you open up a dialogue with these folks and you talk to them and you figure out where they're coming from and you try to explain why I do what I do. I think I probably put out more statements this year than probably put out by Mitchell Hamline in the last 20 years, quite frankly. But it's because we're in a different day and time. And what's been very wonderful this year to see is that I think this is the first time in my 23 years of legal education that my BIPOC students are feeling emboldened to raise and demand things. I always joke because at the beginning of the year here, when I first started, I got a letter from my affinity group leaders that gave me a list of 12 demands, and they said demands. And I stepped back and, at first I'm like, okay, you're going to demand a brand new president to do something, but then I had to check myself and just go, well, yeah, they should be demanding changes, because for so long they've had to just kind of step back and suck it up and just say, try to fit in. But now it's time for us to kind of step back and go, what are we doing? What affirmative steps do we need to take in order to make our whole, our school, our profession, and our communities really feel inclusive to those that have felt excluded for many, many, many decades and years. And so that's what I think is just really important to kind of distinguish here a little bit.
So we just got a question in, and I think this goes to the question that Sarah had. I'm just gonna go through and read it. Could the limited responses to the Floyd statement be the result of cancel culture destroying lives, careers when people disagree or just question such statements and positions? Are all voices accepted in the discussion, or only those that agree with the movement? And I'm going to ask this and frame this in a way. One of my favorite quotes, who I think many can guess who it is, fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. I mean, it seems like that's the issue. What are thoughts on that? How to bring those voices in?
Well, before I answer, or before I have specific thoughts on that, I wanted to just really quickly, sorry, just because I have to leave in a few minutes. I also feel like a word that we're not including in this conversation right now is equity. And I feel like that's really important, that's probably the word that should be used and focused on more even than diversity and inclusion, right? Because when we get caught up in inclusion, then there becomes this, when we get caught up in inclusion, then it's more difficult for people to understand the importance of equity, right? When everyone talks about, okay, everyone should be included, everyone should have a role at the table, then when we try and develop equitable programming, then people feel like there's a disconnect with, okay, if I'm supposed to be included, then why is there programming and resources that are only benefiting these certain groups of people? So on the pledge, the things that y'all are really doing with Mitchell Hamline are really equity programming, right? You're giving specific time, value, resources to BIPOC folks. And so while it is inclusive, it's also equitable. It's uplifting and giving additional space for those who historically haven't had those opportunities. And so even more than just D&I, we really need to bring in and start using equitable and using equity in what we're talking about, because equity gives more wealth, opportunity, and power to unrepresented populations. And that's one of the biggest things that contributes to systemic equality. And so I think that's a really important word that needs to be used in the dialogue, and it doesn't become a dichotomy between inclusiveness and equity, and that inclusion is progress to equity, and equity is our ultimate goal of anything. It's not inclusion, it's not diversity. Diversity already exists. It's here, it's in the space. Inclusion is also an action step, but the ultimate goal is equity, and that we move towards an equitable system where there's a more equal distribution of power and wealth and resources. So I wanted to point that out. And this kind of ties in with the question about cancel culture, maybe not really. I'm focusing on the last part, and all our voices accepted in the discussion are only those that agree with the movement. And I think that goes back to equity. I don't think necessarily, I have different views on cancel culture, but I think the biggest thing is, are we uplifting and giving opportunities for voices and from populations that are regularly silenced or aren't given equitable resources? So, disagreeing with the movement, whatnot, there's different opinions, but what I'm more concerned about is giving voices and giving space for the populations that are at the greatest need for help, for safety, for care, for education, whatever that's going to be. And so I think that goes back to the inclusion versus equity point, right? You can bring everyone's voice to the table, and that's great and that's fine. But at the end of the day, if voices and populations that aren't being represented don't have the opportunity, that's damaging, that's hurtful, and that can be racist. So that's the only point that I wanted to kind of throw out there in the discussion. And I do have to leave. So thank you for having me for this short time. If people want to follow up with conversations or whatnot, I'm sure I can share my email to everyone. This is what I do for my job. So if anyone ever wants to continue these conversations or have thoughts for me about the MSBA or what we can do to support these causes, I am open to hearing from you. So thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
Erica.
so much,
we'll
Erica.
back
I
it
know
up.
you had another commitment this morning, so I really
Yeah.
appreciate you dropping in.
Thank you.
Thanks, Erica. I just want to respond to what Erica said, because you have the methodologies of inclusion and critical thinking and giving people the space to develop opinions through our methods at MSBA or as leaders. But Erica is absolutely right that equity is, the guiding post. So when I think about the moonshot that I would have for the MSBA, or the moonshot I might have if I were in charge of a law school for a day, the end result is going to be not only a commitment to equity, but it's going to be the little things we do every day that we're measuring. So one of the big things at MSBA, when we really work to transform and give more power to the Diversity and Inclusion Council so that they could actually check the MSBA and make sure that we were going to follow through on our commitments, is measurement. So not only do we have measurable goals, but once you start counting the numbers and hold yourself accountable to the numbers and people see what's going on, then you can actually make something happen. And I remember when I worked at 3M, one of the things that Ivan Fong used to say is, if you don't measure it, it won't happen. And I've always taken that with me everywhere I go as a leader. If we don't measure it, it won't happen. So with Erica's point, I would say that, when I look at the Mitchell Hamline pledge and what it's doing and what its commitment is, I assume, and we'll hear from the dean himself, but I assume that Mitchell Hamline is going to have measurable goals. And so even though you might be inclusive in the conversation, and even though you may have all these approaches to making sure people belong and feel like they're part of the conversation, in the end, you're going to have measurable goals and you're going to be held accountable for them, and people will see, you'll show to the world, how are we doing? And so that's the way it all happens. That's the way change happens.
And speaking of those goals, this one's over to you, Dean. Eric Larson had the question and mentioned that he really likes the February 17th, 2021 resolution. So good on that. But his question is, where is Mitchell Hamline at in the audit? And I think that's a good question, is we have these 5 goals. Where is the school at in trying to accomplish this?
I think Robin makes an excellent point, and it's kind of responsive to exactly this question. It's, we have to figure out where are we weak in these areas and what do we have to do to change them. Dr. Kendi came and talked to us at the school. Maybe some of you were there for his talk. But the thing that stuck out most to me and resonated with me the most was, we can have policies that sound neutral, that are race neutral, that, we say that we treat people equally, but yet the effect can still be racist. And so we've got to look at what the outputs are. And if the outputs show that there's a disparate impact on a particular group of individuals, then we aren't doing what we can to break down those racist, or systemic racism within the school or within our profession. Let me give you some examples. If the bar results are different for BIPOC students than they are for our white students, then we've got to figure out what's going on and fix it. And they should be we should have the same. We're admitting the students under the same ideas and the same standards. And so we should be making sure that we have the same type of bar pass rate among all the different groups of people. If membership on our law review is disproportionately off, it means that, that our BIPOC students, if they make up 22% of the population of our school, then 22% of the membership on law review should be there. And if not, then there's a problem and we need to address it and fix it. And so we've got to put through and develop where we have our weaknesses, look at the underlying issues that are causing that, and then fix it. So those are, I think data is what has to drive us. And as part of that audit is really figuring out where we are having those weaknesses. So we're in the middle of doing that right now. I will be announcing in the next day or two our new Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. We've gone through this process this year in a very competitive market, quite frankly, because everybody seems to be looking for a head of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we had some wonderful candidates, and I'm really going to be excited about announcing in the next day or two who that is. But this is when things get really, the audit gets really hopefully completed with pretty soon, because that's going to be the main thing that I'm asking this person to do, is go through what are our policies doing? Are they having an impact? Is retention of our workers different among different groups of people? And how do we adjust that? What is our hiring like? Are there things in our process that are hurting our hiring and making sure that we have diversity? And I mean, there's some things that we've been doing that have been wrong. I mean, just at the very lowest level, every professor hires a research assistant each year. But how does that selection happen? A lot of times professors just hire somebody from their class that they know, and that's it. But we've got to kind of put together an open process so everybody knows about it, because a lot of times first generation students who come in, who are predominantly made up by students of color, don't necessarily know the value of doing that type of work or working with a professor, because they don't have anybody in their families that have gone through law school can say that's a really valuable thing. And so when we're not opening the options up to everybody and announcing it to everybody that there's these openings to work with Dean Niedwiecki or work with Professor so-and-so, then, we're not really opening up opportunity to everybody. And so we're opening an opportunity to those that know, and that tends to be people that come from privilege and comes from families that have been connected to the law. I'm a first generation college student, law student. And so I'm very mindful. I try to be very mindful of these types of things. And, and I'm openly gay, and I came out in law school, and I went to a law school that I felt where I could be comfortable and actually come out. And so I always feel it's important to kind of pay that forward to people that, don't feel included in the law school. And a lot of that is what keeps people from being successful. And so we've got to figure out what is it internally that we're doing that are keeping maybe the numbers low for bar pass, or keeping the numbers low on membership, or our ranking, the class rankings, they should be proportional to our demographics. And if they're not, then there might be an issue there, and we have to identify it. And some of those issues may be a lot harder to deal with than others. And one of the things I really wanted to address at the school that I think I've made some inroads on this year is really the way that we finance legal education. Legal education is financed essentially because U.S. News and World Report drives law schools. Law schools are always trying to get the highest LSATs, because that's the majority of what the U.S. News rankings are on. So law schools pay for high LSATs. And so who gets high LSATs? Well, people who have had those types of opportunities to do well on testing throughout their whole career, families that can afford for them to go through and pay for Princeton Review or all of these LSAT review courses. And then you have these other students who don't have that privilege, that might have gone to a community college, and then from community college gone to a state university and didn't go to a school that really focused them on getting into law school. But still they have the aptitude. They just didn't have the money or the resources to take a Princeton Review or take, one of these review courses to get them in. And that's predominantly a lot of people that are in that group are diverse, or people that come from underrepresented populations. And so what we're having are people that don't have the money essentially paying for the legal education of those that have some privilege in order to get the LSAT. And that's just a generalized statement. I mean, there are people that don't have a lot and really come from very minimal means that do well on the LSAT. But you're more likely to do well on the LSAT if you've got the resources to help you prepare for that exam. And not everybody has those resources. And so I'm trying to change how we actually afford scholarships. And so I'm going to be putting together a needs-based scholarship over the next year in order to encourage and help students who come from minimal means to be able to go to law school. And that money isn't the issue that's driving things for them.
Anthony, can I just ask you a quick question on that LSAT? Because I know that with the ACT and the SAT, there are lawsuits alleging that the test itself women and minorities are disadvantaged in taking that test. Has there been anything out there about the LSAT itself along those grounds?
No, not in modern times. No, I don't think that there's been that kind of a discussion. And I think the LSAT is actually, the LSAC who runs the LSAT is trying to be very conscious of equitable issues related to this. And so they put together a Khan Academy, which is a free bar prep course that they're working with an outside organization that's open to anybody in order to make sure that people are all getting that equal opportunity. And so they're trying to take those types of efforts to improve that. There have been some lawsuits against the LSAT based on disability discrimination, not necessarily based on race or gender. But the LSAT has addressed some of that through their new version of the LSAT Flex, which is the new test that they've been given over the last year or so. But that's the only lawsuit that's been there. And so it's not that the test itself is biased. It's that, and it may be, I don't know, but it's not that the test is biased. It's really kind of how do you prepare for that test and what kind of resources do you have in order to prepare for that test? You know, you go and you look for these testing companies and they'll say, we guarantee we'll raise your test score by 5 or 10 points. But the program costs, $1,000, $1,500. And I don't know about you, when I was going to law school or preparing for law school, I didn't have $1,500 to pay for that. And I didn't have a family that could be able to do that for me. And so I had to kind of do things on my own. And I may not have gotten the highest LSAT that I could have gotten, to get into a law school. And I think that that's true for a lot of students to come into law school. So if we're going to actually see something in their file that shows that they've got the aptitude to be a good lawyer, that they've got the grit and the perseverance in order to be a good lawyer and get through law school, and they have an LSAT that shows that they're have the capability of passing the bar exam and completing law school, then, money shouldn't be something that keeps them from becoming a lawyer. And so let me just give you an example. I'm going to be doing a talk to the IP lawyers next week, the Association of Intellectual Property Lawyers. And I'm talking about how we can improve diversity. But if you just look at the numbers, diversity in law schools have increased significantly over the last 10, 20 years. But we haven't seen the corresponding increase in diversity within the profession. I mean, in just the last 10 years, we've gone from, if you look at Black lawyers, we've gone from 4% in 2010 to 5% in 2020. For Hispanic, the same thing, 4% in 2010, 5% in 2020. Asian went from 0.4% in 2010 to 2% in 2020. And Native Americans actually dropped. So there was 2.7% in 2010 to 0.4% in 2020. And so if we have this increase at law schools, then what's happening that we're not seeing that corresponding increase in the law firms? And I think that there's a number of things. Number one, if you are coming from limited means, students then end up having to work during school, whereas those that have the means don't have to. So they can study 100% of the time for law school. The same thing with the bar exam. The bar exam can be one of those impediments because the bar exam, quite frankly, is a business, and there's a whole industry around the bar exam, and it's very, very expensive. You have to take off work. You have to pay for the bar prep program. You have to pay to take the test itself. And if you fail once, then you have to go through all that again, and you're losing your opportunity to work. And so I think we have to rethink really kind of licensure in order to kind of make sure that that the bar exam isn't one of those barriers that is keeping us from having a diverse workforce. And so I think that there's just so many ways to kind of look at the data, to look at what's going on and what we can do as a law school and as a profession to kind of remove a lot of those barriers. But that's what being an anti-racist law school means. It means actually taking those steps to become not racist, and not just be passive and say, I'm not going to be racist, because that's not enough in our world.
And I think law schools, they're one huge stakeholder in the whole system, right? So there's, things that you can do, and then there's things that are up to others, like law firms, like organizations who hire lawyers, and, that we still see the systemic racism and gender bias in the profession. Just even last night, I was speaking with someone who's suffering horrific gender-based harassment in her workplace. And, these stories are things that I grew up watching. I watched these key cases coming out in the 70s, 80s, that were path-breaking cases regarding gender discrimination. And what's striking to me is I'm still having the same conversation. I'm still having the same conversation that I had 20 years ago with colleagues who are women as I am today. I have a teenager who's about to go to college, and we're still having the same conversations about bias based on gender. So it seems like we haven't necessarily moved forward in our conversations in a way that produces change. And so that's why I'm a big fan of measurement, number one, but I'm also a big fan of taking the big picture. And what I like about the ABA and also the National Conference of Bar Presidents is they can take a system-wide perspective and see the roles of various stakeholders in creating social change. And I think of well-being, for example, in the well-being movement, from a national perspective, lots of stakeholders, how do you create cultural change in the profession? That was the question, tackled by the National Task Force on Lawyer Well-being. And then we see the ABA similarly having those big picture questions answered by galvanizing all the stakeholders. And so I appreciate what Mitchell Hamline has done. I love that they're being, they're in the forefront. They're an innovator on this. And I think Mitchell Hamline has always been that way. They've been the first in a number of ways. And when you have that innovative mindset, you get to set the standard and be a leader and make others follow. But there's just a limit to what a law school can do when you think about the bigger dynamics that exist in the profession, finding a safe place for people of color and women to practice law, where they can just practice law and build themselves rather than constantly defending themselves against all sort of, behavior that drives people, and it would drive anyone out of the profession if you have to, suffer daily micro traumas and then perhaps large significant traumas in the workplace.
Yeah, of course we want to address as widely as we can, but I do think that each one of us has a part to play and a role to play in making that happen. And sometimes things like the ABA or the more national organizations aren't going to move unless we start seeing results by entities that have taken these steps. And so, we weren't the first law school in the country to do an anti-racist resolution. Like I said before, this has really been driven by, by Black women who are deans that have pushed this issue, that if we didn't have that representation, it wouldn't have happened. And so there's a lot of things at play here. So we've got to diversify our profession to really kind of show people that that it's possible to be successful, and successful leaders or successful law students. We've got to diversify our law schools. The Minnesota law schools we're the most diverse law school in the state, but we're not nearly where we should be in terms of diversity, and that's something we've got to work on. So we've got to look for ways that we can build up pipelines to get people into law schools. But I also think it's important for the law school to partner with law firms and legal entities here. And so one of the things we're doing, I was talking about the intellectual property lecture I'm going to do next week. But one of the things we're going to do there is we're going to partner with a law firm that's actually going to work with us on identifying students in STEM programs, and maybe even go back to STEM high schools to alert students about what careers there are in intellectual property. And for those that might be interested in science or engineering or something like that. And so there's got to be some, I think it's good for us to be a partner with these law firms. And so the law firm will help us with that, help identify students, encourage students to apply to law school. And then when they come to law school, these law firms will also help provide mentorship for these students so they can be successful, and also help provide some scholarships and funding for these students so they can afford to go to law school. That way the law firms are invested in these folks, and then they're diversifying their law firms or the entities that they're overseeing. But at the same time, helping the students so they're successful at each one of these points, and helping them overcome any of those barriers as they go along that I think that there are, that we see some of these barriers, and then there's also barriers we don't see that I think are caused by some of the things that you talk about, Robin, that there's a bigger issue of systemic racism or other issues and barriers just within our world and our communities. So
Just wanted to mention that the Institute for Legal Inclusion has been pushing out a pledge, and it's really focused on the future of the profession and building that diversity pipeline that you were just talking about, Dean. And so I encourage people to look at the Institute for Legal Inclusion pledge. That is a pledge, and the MSBA does this very nicely, which is we've always had ABA Day, or we've had days where lawyers go into the classroom and teach about the legal profession, and they get to expose people to the justice system, the rule of law, all those kinds of things. And consistently doing that is really important. I know with the Minnesota Supreme Court, when they had the traveling oral arguments and so forth, there's a partnership with the state bar to go out and educate folks. And that's the way to do it. People don't even know, for example, that their challenge in life or their problem at the moment is actually a legal problem. And so when you get to provide that lens and then empower people to see, oh, there's a legal solution, as opposed to me figuring out my eviction and, trying to navigate all that. Oh, actually the courts matter here, lawyers matter. And you get to do that with folks when they're, younger in high school and even earlier. So I know that, I don't know, Dean, whether the law school has a partnership like that with the community where you go out and, expose people in high school to the legal profession. And maybe it's perhaps beyond the scope of what a law school does. And maybe that really is a bar function. But it seems to me that as many people as possible who are positively demonstrating the value of critical thinking, participation in a justice system, creating the justice system as you participate in it, is something that might inspire people to be the next generation who are entering your law school.
yeah, no, that's exactly right. We do have a program at the school where we work with high school students on exposing them to the law. So, but I want to expand that. And, the one area that I was just talking about with STEM high schools is a perfect place because they're not ones thinking about the law. There might be students in it might be an easier transition for students that are interested in political science or other things, and when they're or government or stuff like that, when they're in high school, that are like, oh yeah, I could see myself going to law school. And it's easier for you to kind of draw that line for them, or that they've been wrong somehow in their lives, or they've seen some injustice that's impacted them, and they know that there could be. It's easier for us to connect the law to those types of lives. But something like the STEM field, I don't think somebody who's going into science and math or engineering are going, oh yeah, I'm doing this because I want to become a lawyer. It's going to those students as well and trying to expose them to how they can use their interest in engineering or science or technology, and how you can be a lawyer and do good. And so that's, it's taking all those steps. But yeah, I think reaching as far back as you can to expose, and if the state bar and lawyers here in Minnesota can do that, I think that that's really helpful. But as a school, that's something we're doing as well. We've also put together a gateway program, and this is for college students who we want to expose them to the law. So we offer them a course that are taught by law professors at the school, and we give the course, and we've been working traditionally with HBCUs. And so students can take a course in health law or something like that, and we offer it to the school. And so the school, we don't charge the school for it. The students just take the course, get the credit at the school that they're at, and then we expose them to the law and what they can do with the law that way by taking an undergraduate course. And I want to expand that now to the colleges that are here in Minnesota, because I think we have, we have people know more about Mitchell Hamline here in Minnesota than maybe nationally, although that's changing with our blended learning program. And so I think it's going to the colleges, going to the high schools, going as early as you can to expose them to how the law can really change their lives, and really kind of giving a positive impression of what lawyers are. I think we saw a big increase in enrollment over the last several years. And I tie a lot of that back to, for the first time in a long, long time, right after the Trump administration started and they did the travel bans. And then all of a sudden you saw all these lawyers flocking to airports, not to make money, but to actually help people. And it was the first time I think I've seen in a long time that the media portrayed lawyers as people that are out there, not selfish, trying to, do something for themselves, but actually out there trying to help people. And I think we're now starting to see the value of what lawyers can do to kind of change our society, whether it was through, things that happened over the last 4 years, or whether it's the pandemic has kind of shown some of the equities in our world. I think our immigration issues, if I sit down with my students and I talk about what drove them to come to law school, it's for the things that you mentioned, Robin. It's because they were exposed to something in their lives that saw that if I had a law degree, I would have been able to deal with this differently. Yeah,
and I think it's, one of the things that all of our lawyers forget sometimes is everything they do, they're a representative. We are a representative of the profession in everything we do. And so we can just model, the justice system and all of our interactions and really show what a lawyer is and what it means to be a lawyer all the time. You mentioned, the travel ban, for example. I remember being at the ABA meeting when when a lot of that was blowing up. We were in Florida. I took a cab from the hotel to the airport, and I was on the phone with someone talking about this whole issue and how we were going to address it in Minnesota. And then I hang up and the cab driver says, I have a really good friend who's stuck at the airport right now. And, he told me his whole story. So then I get on the phone with his friend, have that conversation. I land in Atlanta. I'm having the conversation in Atlanta, then I get back to Minnesota. By then I've connected that person with someone who can actually help them. And it's just like, I don't know what that cab driver ever thought, but I know that he was so grateful when, when I left that cab, that I was going to make something happen for him. And if we all do something like that, just in our everyday way of being, I think we can inspire people to be excited about the legal profession and what's possible.
Yeah, and I think even just, the most recent example of the Chauvin trial, you saw quality lawyering there, and I think that was a good example, and everybody saw that in the country. And I'd like to just take a moment to kind of brag, but on both sides of that case were Mitchell Hamline graduates. And so it's nice to see that, we're representing what lawyering can be, even in difficult types of situations like the Chauvin trial.
So one of the questions, of course, that popped up, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, but what can between Mitchell Hamline and the MSBA, I think that there's overlap. I think there's places we can come together to achieve similar goals and work together. And the question is, what are some of the areas we can do that? Now, I know that we've talked about the pipeline, we've talked about STEM and outreach to the high schools. I will point out, of course, the MSBA, maybe it's just the HCBA, that they kind of blend together right about now. We have the community outreach programs where we can send attorneys out to talk to high school students. Those tend to be more talk to at-risk classes, but there's also things like Claire's Court, where back when we could do in-person stuff, we'd get to go talk to third grade classes and talk to them about what being an attorney is. Are there ways that the Bar Association can meaningfully get together with the law schools and actually accomplish something?
Yeah, I think that, I think there's a number of things. I think we could do kind of break down some of these barriers together so we can maybe come together and give scholarships for the LSAT exam and LSAT prep for students that don't have that opportunity or have that financial means to do that. I think playing a mentorship role in helping students apply to law school and working with, because some people just don't know, what do I put in my file that's going to get me into law school? What do I have to do? Some people don't even know that LSAT prep can really make a big difference for them. So they might just buy a used book and do practice tests and think that that's enough, but there might be techniques to help them do better. I think when they're in law school, I think it's helpful if the bar can help us do mentoring or, following programs where a student would kind of follow an attorney for a week. Or I think that there's just a lot of things in order to support each other. And I think we're doing some of those things, but I think we would probably expand those opportunities even more.
And one thing, from the MSBA perspective, participate in mock trial, fund mock trial to the max. This is a program that, is run throughout the state of Minnesota and inspires people to be lawyers. It gives them the experience of developing those critical thinking skills and performance skills that are so critical to being an attorney. And if you've ever been part of the mock trial program run by MSBA, you've seen it in action, just the outstanding, excellent advocates across the state. And, not all high schools offer it, but many, many do. And so that's one way to do it. And the other is, I agree with what the dean said. There's so many ways that we can be part of this. We used to at MSBA have a program that was part of the mock trial where we went into the high schools for various on a few days per year, maybe law day and another day. Those are other ways to expose students to the possibility of being a lawyer. And finally, I agree with what the dean said about the STEM issue. If I had known when I was in college, I was a STEM major. I was a biology major as well as a political science major. And no one told me the value of, this bio degree at all. And so my last semester in college, I was like, well, I like political science better and I don't really need this bio major thing. So I just, said, forget it. I'm not going to be a bio major, even though I had all the credits. But if someone had said to me, Robin, and in 10 years, you may wish to be a patent attorney, or you may wish to have, those kinds of things, people do not know. And it's just stunning to me how pervasive the law is in every facet of what we do as citizens, as just human beings. And that really needs to be communicated. Just the range of possibilities that we haven't even thought of because we're still inside of our box and we can't get out of it. So we don't even see, but all these diverse people who come into our law schools, who come into our universities are going to be able to redefine that and bust us out of the way we think right now. And so if we want to create that future, I think that the first thing we got to do is inspire people to think big about the law.
Yeah, and I don't want to gloss over, a couple of the questions that were in the chat too about that this isn't, trying to be an anti-racist law school is not easy and it's not necessarily accepted by all. And, this concept of the law being colorblind, well, yeah, on the face, our laws, we've been good about not making the law colorblind. But let's face the fact, the application of the law is not. And, there's a higher increase in incarceration of people of color. They get longer terms when we're looking for the exact same crimes. there's a stat out there that says that 1 out of 1,000 Black men will be shot by a police officer. That's not anywhere near the same for people that are white. And so we've got to really look at what are the results, what are the outcomes of the law and the laws that we have. And if they're disproportionately impacting negatively a group of people, then having this concept that our law is colorblind is meaningless if the results are not the same, if there's a disparate impact on one group over another. And so I think we have to look differently than taking the language that I think the Supreme Court and other courts have taken, saying that, we don't see color in the law. But the reality is the application of the law does see that. And we've got to figure out ways that we can fix the system so that's no longer true. We'll know that our justice system is just if we have proportional representation in prisons, or that we're doing things to kind of change the calculus that more Black people are likely to be in prison than to go to college. I mean, if those are the stats that we're looking at, then there's a problem. And the law is not serving its just purpose. And so we've got to kind of think through and have those difficult conversations about what's happening. And we could always justify a lot of the things that these outcomes and why they're different. But we need to do more than just try to justify and say, well, maybe they did that to get, or maybe they're more likely to commit a crime. Well, what's getting us to that point? So we have to really kind of have those difficult conversations. So I challenge the idea that our law is colorblind. Yeah, on the language of our laws, we're no longer separating people out by class and racial background, ethnicity, but the application of the law definitely is.
Yeah, there's always a gap between the promise of American democracy and its performance. And so we have to be, if we want to change the world and create that promise, we have to have a reality-based way of looking at what's happening in American society. So let's close that gap between the promise of democracy and its performance.
We are at the top of the hour. Thanks, Landon.
I was going to say, on that note, we're at the top of the hour.
I'm happy to go for the rest of the day. I'm wrapped. It's a fantastic discussion. Thank you both so much for joining us this morning. I really, really appreciate it. I'm going to paste in the CLE code. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning, and thanks to Clio, our sponsor for this week's Business as Usual. We'll be back online 2 weeks from now. I believe Joan Biebelhausen will be joining us for a discussion about mental health awareness. She's done a great survey and an article on stressors for among the bench, judicial stressors, which is a very, very interesting paper. We'll be talking a little bit about that. So join us 2 weeks from now on the 20th, same time, 7:30 a.m. Thanks everyone for joining us. Dean, Robin, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Have a great day.